You've completed these 3 steps for your preferences. So what about step 4? And also, what exactly is a preference summary? There's one annoying thing that you might have noticed about our new shape color preference. When you change the color in the settings, it's a little hard here to see what the current color is. Now for the checkbox setting, here, when we change the checkbox status, we can actually see what that means. For example, it's checked on, so it's shown, checked off, so it's hidden. This smaller gray text here is known as the preference summary, and it's meant to contain more info about what the preference is for or its current value. You can set the preference summary to some static text, but what I want to do is have the preference summary show us what our current color is. To do that, I'll need to have the settings fragment update the summary programmatically. This is done in a way that's very similar to how we load the preferences in Visualizer activity. I'm going to head over to the settings fragment now. I'll start by getting a reference to shared preferences in the onCreatePreferences function. Here's my reference to shared preferences, and notice that I'm using the preference screen to get my reference to shared preferences. I also get a reference to the preference screen so that I can get a count of the total number of preferences. Next, I'm going to iterate through all of my shared preferences. And I do that by calling getPreference on the preference screen and passing it an index. I'm going to create a helper method now called setPreferenceSummary, and this method is going to take in a preference and a string value. The purpose of this method is to set the correct preference summary. Setting the correct summary for a list preference is a little bit tricky. We can't just use the key or the value string. Remember, these words right here are the list preference labels, and they're what's shown in the UI. The value and the key are both behind the scenes, and the values are associated with these labels, while the key is associated with the entire preference. In the summary, we want to display the current label, because if we make a localized version of the app, the label will be translated, but the value will not. So the first thing I want to do in my setPreferenceSummary method is check if the preference is an instance of list preference. If it is, I'm going to cast it, then I'm going to find the index of the current preference which was selected, and I'm doing that here using the findIndexOfValue, and then passing in the value. I'll then check if the index is valid, and if it is, I'm going to use this setSummary method for my list preference. And what I'll pass in is I'm taking the list preference here, I'm getting all of the labels, and I'm indexing into that array using the list preference index that I got up here. So this is getting the label that is associated with this value. Okay, now going back up here to my for loop, which again is in the onCreatePreferences method, I'm going to take this preference and check if it's a checkbox preference. And if it's not a checkbox preference, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the value by taking my shared preferences object and using getString with the key, and I'm going to pass that value and those shared preferences to my setPreferenceSummary method. Note that I'm intentionally excluding the checkbox preference here because I changed the checkbox summary by using the onSummary and offSummary XML attribute. Also, this call to getString would cause a runtime error because for checkbox preferences, the value type is a Boolean. Okay, so I'm programmatically setting my preferences on load, so let's go ahead and run the app. Okay, and I can see here that it has a summary now. But if I change this preference, it's not updating the summary. For that, I'm going to need to use a onSharedPreferenceChangeListener. And this is just like in my Visualizer activity. So going to the top of my settings fragment, I'm going to implement onSharedPreferenceChangeListener. And it is of course unhappy because I haven't implemented the associated method, which is onSharedPreferenceChange. So let's do that. Okay, so here's the onSharedPreferenceChange method. So essentially what I'm doing here is I'm finding the preference by its key, and if that preference isn't null, and it's not an instance of checkbox preference, then I'm getting the value and I'm calling setPreferenceSummary. Again, that is almost identical to what I'm doing here. Now that my onSharedPreferenceChangeListener is set up, I need to actually register and unregister it, and I'll do that in the appropriate place, which is onCreate and onDestroy. So I'm going to scroll down to the bottom, and I'm going to override onCreate, and in onCreate, I'm going to get my preference screen, get shared preferences, and register the preference change listener, which again is this, because this up here is the class that has the onShared preference change listener implemented. And I'm going to unregister it by overriding onDestroy. And here I'm just unregistering the listener as well. Okay, let's run the code to see if the summaries are being updated. Now I'm going to try updating the summary to blue. And I see that the summary is updated. Yes.